Think about political power. On one extreme, the crushing silence of a single dictator. On the other, that silence shatters into a surging mob. Between those two extremes lies every government in human history. So how do we objectively measure which ones are just? And how do we design a system that naturally resists its own decay? Over 2,000 years ago, Aristotle laid out the blueprint to answer these exact questions in his foundational text, Politics. Aristotle wasn't like his teacher Plato. Plato spent his time designing perfect philosophical utopias in his head. Aristotle acted more like a political biologist. He wanted to diagnose the real world. His theories were forged in high-stakes reality. He was the personal tutor to history's most ambitious conqueror, Alexander the Great. To figure out what actually worked, Aristotle developed a dual methodology. The first step was purely empirical. He didn't guess. He went out and collected the actual governing constitutions of 158 existing city-states. He gathered data from across the entire Aegean Sea, examining how different societies managed laws, property, and power, and funneled that raw data into a single comprehensive study. But data collection wasn't enough. His second method was teleological. In philosophy, a telos is an end goal. Aristotle evaluated these 158 governments by asking whether the sovereign power governed for its own benefit or for the common good of the whole city. Aristotle studied governments not as ideals, but as they exist. His goal was to find a stable, functional reality, not a perfect dream. To understand how Aristotle structured that reality, we have to scale our thinking down. He wasn't analyzing massive nation-states. He was looking at the Greek polis, intimate, self-contained communities where political decisions had immediate, visible consequences. From his massive pile of data, he built a matrix. This grid is the core scoring framework for understanding his entire theory of regimes. He defined the horizontal axis by the mechanical structure of power, the number of rulers. A state can be ruled by a single person, by a select few, or by the many. The vertical axis is defined by intent. Does the sovereign rule for the common good or for their own private interest? This gives us 6 forms of government. The top row contains the 3 correct forms. In these systems, whoever holds power exercises it for the benefit of all citizens. If a single virtuous person rules for the public good, you have a monarchy. If a highly capable elite few rule for the public good, you have an aristocracy. And if the broad mass of citizens manages the state for the benefit of the whole, you have what Aristotle called a polity. But human nature is fragile. When rulers become selfish, those correct forms corrupt downward into 3 deviant states. Monarchy rots into tyranny when the ruler serves only themselves. Aristocracy devolves into oligarchy when the wealthy exploit the state to line their own pockets. Aristotle defines democracy as a deviant form. For him, a democracy was mob rule, where the poor majority governed solely to enrich their own faction at the expense of everyone else. This matrix reveals that the mechanical structure of a state, how many people hold the levers of power, matters far less than the moral intent of the sovereign. Sovereignty is defined by the community it serves, rather than the headcount of its rulers. Out of all 6 forms, Aristotle identifies polity as the best practical target for a real-world society, not the most perfect, but the most resilient. Without an anchor, political systems naturally slide into extremes. Society gets ripped apart by class warfare, swinging wildly between the concentrated hoarding of an oligarchy and the retaliatory seizures of a radical democracy. To stop that pendulum, a polity acts as a highly engineered mixed constitution. It deliberately blends the wealth elements of an oligarchy with the popular numbers of a democracy. This chart shows how Aristotle tackled the underlying math of stability. He realized that drafting laws was only half the battle. You needed the right socioeconomic foundation, specifically wealth distribution. And his absolute requirement for a surviving polity is right here in the center, a large, robust middle class. Aristotle analyzed the psychology of the extremes. He observed that the ultra-rich are often too arrogant to obey laws, viewing themselves as untouchable. The ultra-poor, meanwhile, are too desperate to govern fairly, driven by immediate survival. The middle class acts as a physical wedge keeping those 2 warring extremes apart. Because they have a stake in the system, they naturally defer to the rule of law. They aren't trying to steal the state's wealth, and they aren't trying to burn it down. The polity is not a utopian dream based on perfect people. It is a practical, mathematically balanced buffer designed to neutralize the human pathologies of power. But a state is only as functional as its atomic units, so we have to zoom in from the macro architecture of the government to the individual citizen. Aristotle separates the concept of a citizen from birthright, geography, or the mere right to legal protection. True citizenship has two requirements. First, you must have a share in deliberative office, meaning you have a direct hand in debating and creating the laws of the city. Second, you must have a share in judicial office, meaning you sit on juries and actively administer justice. The Aristotelian citizen only exists in this overlap. You are someone who actively participates in both the drafting of the rules and the enforcement of the consequences. Merely living within the city walls does not grant you this status. Resident aliens, merchants, and manual laborers are entirely excluded from this core. Aristotle even draws a distinction between a good man and a good citizen. A good man pursues absolute moral excellence in all aspects of life. But the virtue of a good citizen is relative. It is measured purely by how well they uphold their specific constitution. For Aristotle, a citizen is a verb. Participation is the requirement for belonging. Residence is merely a location. This status demands the active, ongoing duty of ruling and being ruled in turn. However, acknowledging Aristotle's limitations is mandatory for any comprehensive academic analysis of his work. His elegant geometry hides some incredibly harsh realities. First is the exclusionary nature of his system. Because his definition of active citizenship requires immense leisure time to debate and judge, it permanently bars women, slaves, and manual laborers from political existence. The common good didn't include them. Second is the issue of contextual scale. His entire matrix is calibrated strictly for a small, intimate community. Applying a system that demands direct daily participation to a massive, diverse modern nation-state poses immense logistical challenges. Third is an undeniable elite bias. By defining democracy as a deviant, mob-driven form of government, Aristotle reveals a deeply entrenched aristocratic prejudice against the working poor. When a political system excludes the vast majority of its population from having a voice, the stability of the state becomes an illusion. Under enough pressure, those marginalized voices will fracture the foundation. These critiques don't invalidate the underlying mechanics of his theory. But they do require us to strip away his ancient prejudices if we want to apply his frameworks to the modern world. While Aristotle's architectural logic for balancing factions was structurally sound, its original application was inherently elitist and exclusionary. Despite those blind spots, Aristotle's mechanics survived. Look closely at history, and you'll see his concept of the mixed polity evolving into modern parliamentary democracies. The scale of governments has expanded exponentially from the ancient city-state, yet we still use his methods to stabilize massive populations today. Aristotle's insistence on blending wealth classes and power dynamics is the direct intellectual ancestor to the concept of checks and balances found in constitutional republics. His theory of the middle class is just as potent. Economists and political scientists still recognize that a shrinking middle class is a primary leading indicator of democratic instability and polarization. Modern democratic architects understood Aristotle's mandate. Because you cannot guarantee perfect rulers, you must build robust institutions that accommodate human flaws. And his warning about apathy has never been more relevant. A state filled with passive consumers who only demand rights, rather than active citizens fulfilling their duties, will inevitably collapse into oligarchy or tyranny. From the geometry of his power matrix, to the economic anchor of the middle class, to the demand for active participation, Aristotle systematically deconstructed the state to show us how it actually works. For Aristotle, the best government is not ideal, it is practical, balanced, and rooted in the common good. He proved that to build a lasting society, political science must always marry empirical reality with ethical purpose.